Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in a couple of minutes. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vakanda Medley, and welcome to the Digital Health Technology Derived Biomarkers and Outcome Assessments for Remote Monitoring and Endpoint Development webinar. We have a full house, so we will start off with a presentation of slides, followed by questions and answers. Please submit your questions in the chat section featured below, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. We ask that you please always remain muted and keep your video off. The presentation will be recorded and placed on our YouTube page. I will be sending that link along with the presentation slides to everyone that has registered. I will now turn it over to our program director, Dr. Carol Taylor-Burds.
Thanks, Rakanda, and thanks everyone for joining today. We do have a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right in. Briefly, we're going to be going through a little bit of background. We're going to do some introductions about the program staff on today, and then get into some background on funding opportunities, some terms that people need to be familiar with, the scope of the funding opportunity, NIH participating institute focus areas, and then we will wrap up with some question and answers. And as Vakanda said, we ask everybody to hold the questions till the end, but feel free to start entering them in the chat as they come up. So I'm Carol Taylor-Burds. I'm a program director at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke in our translational division. I'm joined here by my colleagues, and I'd ask each of them to just briefly introduce themselves, starting with my colleague, Dr. Kristi Hardy.
Hi, I'm Kristi Hardy. I'm a program director in the Division of Clinical Research at NINDS, and I am certainly somebody who can also answer questions about NINDS participation in the SNOPO along with Carol.
Thanks, Kristi. And Dana?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dana Wolff-Hughes. I am a program officer in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the National Cancer Institute, and I hold a portfolio that includes digital health technologies, data science, and risk factor assessment.
Hi, my name is Yuan. I'm the program director with the National Institute on Aging and with the branch of clinical intervention and diagnostic branch. I manage the applications related to the biomarkers, including digital technology derived biomarkers. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody. All right, and we also have with us Drs. Adisa C. Liu and Cynthia Gounder, who are health program specialists at NINDS and will be moderating our Q&A this afternoon. as well as Rakhanda Medley, our operations coordinator, who you met already. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So we want to start off by talking a little bit about why do we need validated remote assessments. And we know that it's critical to increase participation and representation in clinical trials. But we also know that many people can't participate because it's too challenging to travel to the clinical sites because of barriers such as distance, time, cost, etc. The other major value of remote assessments is from the ability to gather more frequent measurements, which may detect a response to an intervention that is missed when measurements are only made every few months or years. However, determining what to measure, how to measure it, and how often to measure it, not to mention how to analyze and interpret the results, requires significant development and validation, and requires input from multiple stakeholders. So the goals of this funding opportunity are to encourage collaboration across disease areas to pool resources and support research to generate the data needed for the development, analytical validation, and proof of concept clinical validation of digital health technology derived assessments and monitoring biomarkers to be used as future endpoints in clinical trials for 3 or more disease areas. Now, there is a lot packed into those goals, and we're going to break that down just a little bit more to go over some of the terminology. So first, what are we talking about when we're talking about digital health technologies? And these are often referred to as sensor-based digital health technologies as well. And these are a system that uses computing platforms, connectivity, software, or software health, and or sensors for healthcare and related uses. And so within the scope of this funding opportunity, we're talking about things like wearable sensors, mobile application-based cognitive or functional assessments, and at-home monitoring technologies. So when we're talking about biomarkers and clinical outcome assessments, I'm not going to read these definitions to you, but essentially a biomarker reflects a biological process, while a clinical outcome assessment reflects how a person feels, functions, or survives. Now, an endpoint may be either a biomarker or a clinical outcome assessment, but in either case, it requires you to define how the biomarker or clinical outcome assessment is measured, when it is measured, and a number of other details that need to be developed in order to develop the statistical analysis plan when you're designing a clinical trial. So for this funding opportunity, when we're talking about biomarkers or clinical outcome assessments, we're really talking about digital health technology derived biomarkers and COAs, so ones measured by digital health technologies. So 2 more terms we want to just quickly cover. Concept of interest, which is pretty straightforward. Essentially, what is the biological, clinical, or functional concept that you're trying to measure? And then context of use is a brief statement to clearly explain how and when your biomarker or clinical outcome assessment is going to be used. And that should really address how they will be used to complement or replace existing assessments, as well as why they're needed. So there are a lot of different types of validation, and I think most people are familiar with the first couple of these, right? Validation, most NIH research includes some form of construct or contact validation. So this funding opportunity goes beyond that and also is looking at fit-for-purpose analytical and clinical validation to assess the performance of the digital health technologies when they're used as proposed, so the analytical validation, and to establish if the digital health technology derived biomarkers or clinical outcome assessments can identify, measure, or predict the concepts of interest intended, so the clinical validation. So just to sort of pull us together a little bit in a sort of straightforward example, you know, if we were talking about something like sleep disturbance as the concept of interest that you want to measure, you might have several different technologies that you could use to measure it. So say a wrist-worn or a body-worn sensor. And then the endpoint itself is going to be something like the total sleep duration, the number of wake-ups. And so you've got within that measurement, the algorithm measuring the biometric data from the wearable sensors to determine if the person's asleep or awake, the quantification of time of sleep versus awake, the number of events of wake-ups over, say, 24 hours or the night, and then how many days is the assessment going to be made? What's the frequency? how many weeks or months are going to be monitored. So there's a lot that goes into that endpoint development. So again, these slides are all going to be shared, and just listing out some examples of the types of questions that need to be considered when you're developing and validating an endpoint. Not all of these apply to every use case, and there are certainly other questions that should be considered as well, but this is just to give some examples. So we're going to switch gears and talk about the funding mechanism and funding opportunity itself now. So this is a phased UG3 UH3 cooperative agreement, and the first phase can be 1 to 2 years, followed by a second phase, which can be 3 to 4 years, but these cannot exceed a 5-year period. And just a reminder that you need to include the application, within the application, both phases need to be included. So what about scope? So within the first phase, and this is examples of types of activities that can be included. This is not an exhaustive list, but the first phase could include things like device selection and analytical validation pilot studies to optimize how you're measuring the biomarkers or outcome assessments. You could include things like head-to-head comparisons of different digital health technologies to select the best performing ones, or evaluate generalizability to see if you can use multiple devices to measure the same endpoints. You could evaluate factors that might interfere with the precision and accuracy of the measurements. And then there are things like finalizing the protocols before you go into the UH3 phase, establishing final statistical analysis and data management plans, and so on. You could also include activities like developing user-informed consent and training materials for the UH3 phase. And you can, and just want to point out that the NIH just this year published some consideration points for using digital health technologies in your informed consent. And so I'd really encourage everyone to take a look at that. And that link is also in the funding opportunity. In addition, you can include outreach activities to establish collaborations with communities that are historically underrepresented in clinical studies, which might include racial and ethnic minorities, individuals in rural populations, or individuals with limited English proficiency. And this is actually going to be addressed in the community engagement plan, which is in the other attachments that we'll talk about in just a couple of slides. So then for the UH3 phase, this is really going to be focused on doing that prospective longitudinal clinical proof of concept validation study. So you're really looking at how do these assessments perform. If you can also include as part of your context of use, if you want to, how do they perform in response to a therapeutic or behavioral intervention? However, we want to point out, these funding opportunities don't allow therapeutic clinical trials within the scope. So if you're evaluating the biomarker or outcome assessment in response to an intervention, it needs to be as part of standard of care or as an ancillary study to an existing clinical trial. And then if you're seeking or planning on seeking regulatory approval, then you can certainly include activities to support engagement with appropriate regulatory agencies, such as an FDA critical path innovation meeting or one of the drug development tool programs. So there are a few unique features of this funding opportunity that we want to just briefly touch on to make sure people are aware of and take a little bit more look at. And we're going to talk about most of these on the next couple of slides. So first, we have all had many workshops, and we all know the importance of having partnerships with patient advocacy organizations, and really critical having people with lived experience involved in thinking about in terms of helping inform study design, endpoint selection, and also thinking about how do we increase community uptake. So this is a little unusual for most funding opportunities, but this one does require that you include 3 or more diseases or conditions And we're doing this because we really want to encourage not many different types of endpoints that are all trying to measure the same concept of interest, but we want to look for where are their shared needs and encourage some of that standardization to happen early. It also can help to promote the collaboration and the pooling of resources, because these are resource-intensive efforts. And finally, I want to just point out that we're not going to tell you how to define a disease or a condition. So it's up to you in your application. You need to include how are you defining it, and then you want to specify and justify how you're defining what is a distinct disease or condition, and what's the shared endpoint needs across all three. So why were they selected? Why are they appropriate? So again, the goals of the funding opportunity are to develop and validate remote assessments in order to get, help generate the evidence needed to get endpoints that can be used as primary or secondary endpoints in clinical trials. And again, addressing the context of use. How would these be used? What types of clinical trials? And this is a broad definition. This might be therapeutic development. This could be rehabilitation studies. This could be behavioral interventions. But why are these types of assessments needs? Why are these concepts of interest important to measure? And what's the limitation of existing assessments? How are these going to be an advantage? So there are a number of other attachments within the funding opportunity. The first three are required, and we're going to talk about the first one a little bit more. Also, of course, if you're using an associated clinical trial, having the clinical trial protocols and consent forms included is important. And then if you're planning on commercializing the technology or the software algorithms being used, then you'd want to include an intellectual property plan. We assume most people are going to include letters of support from patient advocacy organizations or collaborators and so on, but technically that's not a requirement. So let's just talk about the timeline and milestones a little bit more. So first, this is the information that's in the funding opportunity. You want to include both quantitative milestones and qualitative progress milestones. And we're going to talk about a couple of examples here. So we looked at funding opportunity, or in the description of funding opportunity, we have this UG3, UH3 phase mechanism. And so you want to make sure that milestones should include both the annual milestones and the go, no-go milestones. And this can be up to 3 pages in the other attachments. So the annual milestones are going to help demonstrate continued progress, whereas the go, no-go milestones are going to transition. This is the transition point between the UG3 phase and the UH3 phase. And you want to think about these in terms of deliverables. What are the deliverables from that first phase to show that you have what you need to move on to the UH3 phase and that it's going to be useful and feasible? So for the timeline and proposed milestones, these are just a couple of examples. You don't have to use them exactly like this, just to give you an idea of what we're looking for. So a progress milestone for a UG3 phase might be something like completing the feasibility study, using the digital health technologies, and obtaining input from people with lived experience to collect input on device selection, the study protocols, and so on. And you're going to want success criteria. How do you demonstrate that you have successfully met this milestone? Then you want to briefly justify why you selected those success criteria. So an example of a UG3, UH3 transition go, no-go milestone might include something like performance milestone, something where we're going to determine which of the digital health technologies tested in the UG3 phase met the performance criteria and can still be used in the UH3 phase. So success criteria might include things like the usability, accuracy, reliability, and so on. And again, you want to think about the justification in terms of why you selected those performance criteria. Why are those important to measure and show? So finally, for a UH3 phase, because this is going to be a prospective longitudinal study, you're going to be thinking about things like the recruitment of the number of participants and the quality metrics used for obtaining the data. And you might also want to really think about not just the total number of participants, but are you meeting sufficient numbers for each of the diseases or conditions, or the overall diversity goals? And for all of these milestones, just remember that you really want to be quantitative, and you've got, again, 3 pages to document this and include your timeline, and really thinking about how are you going to demonstrate continued success. So non-responsive studies, I won't read this either, but I really want to make sure that everyone takes a look at this in the funding opportunity, because if you're a non-responsive study, you can be administratively withdrawn before review. If you have any questions about whether or not you're eligible, please do reach out, because we don't want you to go through the effort if it's not going to be within scope of the funding opportunity. So I am going to now turn it over to my colleague, Kristi, who's going to talk a little bit about the NINDS efforts.
So we just want to review research areas that might be of particular interest to the various institutes that have signed on to this effort. And for NINDS, most of you are aware that we are going to be interested in applications that assess priorities for neurological conditions, and this includes conditions across the lifespan. We particularly acknowledge that some of these measurements that may be needed if you're studying pediatric populations versus elderly populations or others may be really, really different and require distinct efforts. And so we welcome responsive applications that address different areas of the lifespan. And this NOFO is particularly aligned with our most recent strategic plan. And in that plan, it was noted that NINDS really is dedicated to developing and validating biomarkers and outcome measures as a specific priority. And another priority for our institute is to promote health equity for individuals with neurological conditions, specifically by supporting efforts to be inclusive in validation studies and to develop remote assessments that can hopefully promote inclusion and reduce barriers to participate in clinical trials. We also just wanted to talk about some related NOFOs that you may want to check out as you are exploring it, whether this or other opportunities may be the most appropriate mechanisms for your research studies. And so here are several projects and or funding opportunities in which NINDS is participating that may also be really appropriate and relevant for your research that we encourage you to check out.
Thanks, Kristi.
Hi, this is Yuan again. About the NIA interest on this funding opportunity, we share many interests with NINDS and NCI on developing this funding opportunity. As a leading federal agent for research on AD-ADRD research, we are focused on this NOFO to encourage applications to develop, validate, and verification of remote digital monitoring biomarkers and a digital clinical outcome assessment for age-related neurological disorders and ADRD. ADRD serve as an example what Kara mentioned for this particular NOFO. We encourage to shared outcome assessment for multiple diseases. So such as ADRD's LBD, FTD, and late and vascular-related VCID and mixed dementias. We also support the scientific collection of data, systematic collection of data, and scientific analysis of data, and disseminate of informations, interpret clinical meaningful informations. This novel fits very aligns with the NIA mission, as we know that age is a risk factor for many chronic diseases that impacts on social economics. NIA mission is to meet these challenges by providing research support for the genetic, biological, and behavior social research on aging, and also to support the research resources and the information dissemination. This also meets the NIA NAPA research implementation milestones. For example, milestone 9 is to develop minimum invasive biomarkers. And 11 is enable technology for disease monitoring. So those are identified experts and written into law 10 years ago. And we also have joint effort to promote disease, to promote health equity, because this is a perfect remotely accessible biomarkers or devices can overcome those barriers for participations. Thank you. Oh, sorry. There are some related funding opportunities. The first one is validation, clinical and analytical validation of biomarkers for AD, ADRD. And this mostly can be fluid biomarkers, but it can also includes the digital derived biomarkers. We also have the notice of special interest for small business, for early detection, and also the next one, 20048, is for digital technology for early detection ADRD, which is R01, R21 mechanisms. And as we see, this fits the pipeline for the digital biomarker development in the earlier stage. And the current, this NOFO is for the endpoint assessment. And we also have recently approved concepts which has not released funding opportunities, those including the infrastructure building is a national center for accelerating use of digital health technology in ADRD research that will create some repository harmonization and so on. And we also have approved for standardization of digital tools that are more suitable for small business applicants. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Dana?
Thanks, Carol. So to give a little bit of an overview about NCI's focus for this funding opportunity, we're aligned broadly with anything that is in the NCI's mission and our scientific priorities, which are outlined on our website, and focus on the development and validation of cancer-specific digital monitoring biomarkers, clinical outcome assessments, and endpoints. I do want to note, given sort of the requirement of this funding opportunity to have 3 or more sort of diseases, that in cancer, we look at cancer as a group of diseases, and so applicants can define each cancer type or subtype, and so we include within this subtype definition molecular subtypes as separate diseases as justified scientifically in your application. Some areas that we are particularly interested in receiving sort of applications in are proposals that look at addressing unmet needs in high-risk, understudied, or underserved cancer populations. And that includes individuals with, say, early onset cancers, rare cancers, or pediatric cancer survivors, for example, as well as rural patient communities. Developing and validating digital biomarkers to monitor cancer treatment-related symptoms, sequelae, and/or outcomes. And that could include, for example, adverse events, late effects, toxicity, pain, etc. Those that are interested in maybe using a digital health technology that is collecting analyte data from an electrochemical DHT is of interest. Those that are monitoring physiological status or clinical outcomes associated with physical function, nutrition or dietary status, or outcomes related to physical fitness, such as aerobic capacity or sleep or circadian disruption. And then those DHT measured remote digital biomarkers to monitor treatment response and inform potentially down the line treatment selection, dosing, and adaptive designs. Next slide. So in terms of related NOFOs, I want to sort of point out that these change all the time. And so I encourage everyone to go to the NIH guide, not just for NCI, but just even for anything at NIH that's funded. A few of these include Smart Health, which is an interagency program with the National Science Foundation that all the participating ICs on this webinar also participate in. There's one focused on academic and industrial partnerships, as well as a couple of NOCs. One is a validation of digital health and AI tools that NIA is also signed on to. And then another one focused on technology development for cancer control and population sciences, which is aligned with our IMAT and ITCR programs. And so if you Google IMAT, IMAT, or ITCR, those are two programs that fund a lot of technology in molecular and information technology. And then lastly, there's a funding opportunity released out of NIBIB focused on quantum sensing technologies. Next slide. So I also want to mention that the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research is signed on to this funding opportunity. This can sometimes cause confusion for the community because OBSSR is not a funding agency. They are not able to hold and fund grants. They are able to work with individuals like Carol, Kristi, Yuan, and I to support research that is going to be funded by NIH. And so we just want to note that. And if you are interested in something in the behavioral and social sciences, reach out to one of us as the program officers, and we can connect with OBSSR in the background. Next slide. And then lastly, in terms of the budgets for this initiative and the need for prior approval, in the funding opportunity, it notes that budgets are not limited, but need to reflect the needs of the proposed project. However, if you are going to request over $500,000 or more in direct costs in any year, each of our institutes requires prior approval. In addition, while these links here take you to each institute, I want to note that it's really important to reach out to one of us early and often about this, because each of our institutes have different processes and procedures for you to be able to gain approval. And so going to the links here are really helpful to get a general sense of what that looks like, but also you're going to need to proactively talk to a program officer as soon as possible if you anticipate this going over $500,000 or more. Next slide.
Thank you. So another important part of the application is the data managing and sharing policy. So NIH has a commitment to making the results of any research available and to also promote the sharing of scientific data. Therefore, applications that are either planning to generate data will need to submit a data and managing sharing plan. These plans are not part of the scored peer review criteria, but are going to be reviewed by the NIH program staff, and also those program staff will have to approve the plans prior to the award. So NIH does expect investigators to, again, plan and budget for the management of the sharing of the data, as well as, again, submit the data management plan for review, but also comply with the approved data management plan. The link below also kind of gives more information about that and also shares data managing plan examples that can be utilized to formulate your own. Next slide. Finally, the receipt date, the first receipt date to this NOFO is February 21st, 2025. The link to the notebook it has more information about the application due dates upcoming, as well as the review and award cycles for the upcoming receipt dates in the future. Next slide. Again, we would like to thank you for attending the webinar, and we will now proceed to questions.
All right, thank you, everyone. And I'd invite my other colleagues to join the panel discussion now. I see we've got a number of questions in the chat already, and Aditha and Santil are going to moderate that and read those, and we will answer accordingly. Thanks.
Okay, I'm reading the first question. So the first question is, are the implantable device that record data like stimulators and cardiac device in scope of this project?
So if it requires, so one is going to be about the use case, right? So is it for monitoring biomarkers or clinical outcome assessments, or is it a therapeutic device? So a therapeutic device is not going to be within scope. If it's for monitoring and can collect data remotely, then it would be within scope.
All right. Next question is there a direct to second phase option?
No, so with small businesses, that can be an option, but in this case, you need to include both the UG3 and the UH3 phase.
The third question is already answered by Dan. So if clinical trials are not permitted, how would sensitive to change the digital biomarker to assessed? So I'm going to skip that one, and then I'm going to go to the next question. Can the study settings be skilled nursing facility or long-term acute care facilities? Or is the setting strictly pure outpatient?
I think we would probably need to see a little bit more details to understand exactly what's being proposed there. So I would encourage you to reach out to whichever institute you think this would be coming in, and we can clarify that.
Thank you. And the following question is, for NINDS, are several diseases included as FTD be included as 3 diseases?
Right, so this, again, it's going to be up to you to define what the disease is, why you're separating them as different diseases, right? We know certainly in the neuroscience space, there's a lot going on with how do we do a biological definition versus a clinical definition. So you really want to put in how you're defining it, why you're defining it that way, and justify it. And then reviewers will comment if they think it's appropriate or not.
Okay, there is one more question. Are the devices that conduct both monitoring and therapeutic action in the scope?
So you can't have, and I know I ran through the exclusion criteria pretty quickly. So you can't have a clinical trial if the trial is to develop a therapeutic. So if you're just looking at the monitoring aspect, but you're using a device that's already being given as part of standard of care, and you're just looking at the data that you're analyzing from that device, collecting from that device, and using it for monitoring, that would be acceptable. But if you have any questions, again, I think some of these get very nuanced. So if you have any doubt, I really encourage you to put together a draft aims page or a little description of the project and then reach out and we can kind of talk through it more.
For now, that's all the questions that we have. We encourage everybody to please submit the questions in the chat.
And I know we had a raised hand a minute ago. If you want to ask your question live, feel free to raise your hand and we can move to that now. Otherwise, we'll just give it a few minutes. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't want to type the whole thing out, but I want to know about will we be dinged for biomarker not being comprehensive for a disease? Because I think we've gotten that feedback before where we're not addressing all the aspects of a disease or condition. If we have something very specific like speech, but it doesn't address any of the motor changes that occur in the disease, will that be a negative?
So this is why the context of use is so important, because you really want reviewers to understand what is it you're trying to measure. Why is that not being captured with the other assessments? This is when we say, is it complementary to existing assessments or is it a replacement? So if this is something that's adding in, you're capturing something that can't be captured normally, you want to make that clear to reviewers. What's the need and why is this important to be able to measure? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I have another question though. And that's when we're considering different diseases and conditions, can our biomarker of, say, speech, for example, be can it differ in terms of exactly what it's measuring in different neurological populations, for example? Or do you want the specific outcome to be exactly the same across conditions?
Right. No, it's a good question. So we're thinking in terms of what's the concept of interest? What's the aspect of the diseases that you're trying to capture? You're trying to look for standardized ones. Right. There are a lot of shared concepts that are important to multiple diseases. How exactly they're measured, this is going to help you aggregate some of that data and understand, do they change at different rates? Is there disease-specific aspects that you might be able to compare across these different disease populations, but you're still trying to measure that same concept of interest in 3 or more disease areas. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
And again, feel free to put together an AIMS page, and it's always easier to kind of talk this through in a little bit more detail if it gets a little bit nuanced.
Okay, thank you.
Cheryl, can I add to that, just to clarify? This is monitoring, and it's also sort of endpoints and outcome assessments. So we would imagine that some of these measures across diseases would generally perform the same, say sleep, because that you're just using it for monitoring versus if you were using it as a therapeutic, which is why that is excluded from this funding opportunity. We're focusing specifically on this window of biomarkers and endpoints.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. Important. And again, we want to emphasize we are encouraging collaboration, right? So these are going to be larger teams because of the different disease areas. So really looking for you to reach out to other groups with shared interests and try to put proposals together and come in together.
We do have a comment in the chat, and I'm not sure if you can comment on it, is how many applications do you anticipate it to be funded?
Right, so we all know that right now we don't know what the budget is and that it is a fiscally challenging time. So we don't know the answer to that at this point, and we will stay tuned and see what happens. So yeah, that's all I can add for right now. And we'll give it just a couple more minutes if people are thinking about questions. Otherwise, we can always end a little early and people can get a few minutes before their next meeting.
I have a question. Sorry, it probably pertains to a similar question I asked before about specific biomarkers and disease process. So is it expected this could be neurologic specific biomarker, or it could be any biomarker, let's say heart rate or glucose, or is it preferred to be a neurologic specific biomarker?
So it's going to depend on your context of use, your patient populations. How are you going to use it? What is it you're trying to capture with those markers? Why is it important for the diseases that you're including? Right, that's really, again, how is it going to be used and why is it important? And then, of course, it also depends on which populations you're targeting. So we have NCI on here, we have NIA, so we're going beyond just the neurological, as long as it's within one of the other participating institute missions.
Thank you.
And one other thing I'll just add, so we are going to be posting the slides and these will be sent out to everyone. We do have some links to some other information, and this is just going to be for people's awareness. There's some resources, not any particular endorsement, but other information that people can explore if they're sort of thinking about what they want to do or looking for what else is going on in their areas. All right. I think that might be a wrap. Hopefully that was helpful for everyone. I really want to thank all my colleagues again for participating in this, and we're looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays. Have a good afternoon.